Hello, this is Richard Thornton. Welcome to the Ancient Roots series, which is our series of videos which address the indigenous people of the southeastern United States. We're coming from the Salty Creek Valley and Chimney Mountain Valley, which is a region abounding in ancient stone ruins and petrographs. The Appalachian Foundation is currently carrying out a survey of the hundreds, literally hundreds, of stone ruins in this area that stretch from Lake Burton in the north southward to southern Habersham County. These are a mystery. I cannot tell you at this moment who created these stone ruins and petrographs. They're very similar to those of early Bronze Age Sweden. You go figure. Mama always said life is like a box of chocolates, and that certainly was the case in April 1976, right after I graduated with a degree in urban planning from Georgia State University. My planning clients in April 1976, as I was working with a new employer who was a planning consulting firm, were Waverly, Alabama, and the Eastern Band of Cherokees. I was shocked to discover that the town council was composed of people who were descended from the Creek Indians. That was a new one. I mean, they looked like my relatives in eastern Georgia. Waverly was originally the Sokee Creek town of Thlopthlocco. And on the Cherokee Reservation, Sokee Gap, on the eastern edge of the reservation, was originally Sokee Gap, which is the same word as the Sokee River in northeastern North Georgia. The Cherokees had no explanation for that. Another interesting thing was that my primary client with the Eastern Band of Cherokees was Chief Arnichi. 40 years later, I would realize that Arnichi is a Spanish Sephardic Jewish name. What was a man who everyone thought to be full-blooded Cherokee doing with a Spanish Sephardic last name? That's the subject of another one of our videos, though. I found in research that early South Carolina colonial archives describe the Sokee as being culturally advanced, military powerful, and looking like Mexican Indians. They were described as probably the most powerful Native American polity in that part of North America. But keep in mind that at that time, South Carolina stretched, at least in British claims, to the Mississippi River. So when they say South Carolina, they really meant northeast Georgia. That wasn't to last very long, though. In 1665, and actually before then unofficially, the Commonwealth of Virginia legalized the institution of slavery and armed the Rickahawkins in the western part of that colony to go southward and capture thousands of indigenous peoples to serve as slaves on the tobacco plantations in Virginia. These actions almost depopulated many areas of the southern Appalachians and Piedmont. Then, in 1696, a smallpox plague killed a large proportion of the Sokee, Appalachee, Coshocton, and Ishiti peoples in North Georgia. Most of the survivors fled southwestward. This left the Georgia mountains with a very thin population. It's probable that there were even fewer people living in the North Carolina mountains after this plague struck. For several decades, the word Sokee or anything similar disappeared from the maps of South Carolina and then in Georgia. Finally, in 1746, we see a town that's now considered Cherokee on the southern edge of their boundaries with the name of Miccosukee. Now, the he suffix is Totonac, and the Totonac language is incorporated partially into the Maya and the Ishiti Creek languages. So what we have is a town that at least the British authorities considered to be associated with the Cherokees with a Mesoamerican name. The location of Sokee was on the Sokee River near present-day Clarksville, Georgia, in the rich bottomlands of the river as it begins to slow down and then hits the waterfalls. However, later maps no longer show Sokee, but show a town named Sokee farther north at the headwaters of the Sokee River. It's a different location than the 1746 map. Sokee was where Batesville is now, while Sokee was on the west side of Clarksville. Just north of Batesville is currently the site of Lake Burton, which is created by a dam on the Tallulah River, which then was called the Tuileries River. About mid-century or later, we begin hearing of a town of Ishiti-speaking Seminoles called Miccosukee. They were, in each one of the Seminole Wars, able to avoid capture. They moved farther and farther south, eventually locating at the site of an ancient mound southeast of Lake Okeechobee. Little more is heard of these people. They're briefly mentioned by John Swanton in his book on the Southeastern Indians. When he wrote the book in 1929, Swanton assumed that the Creeks had always lived where they were in 1776 when they were visited by the botanist William Bartram. So he placed the Creek-speaking towns no farther north than the Georgia mountains. He shifted his understanding of the path of the DeSoto expedition to go through the Georgia mountains, which is probably not correct. And he placed the Miccosukees as always being in South Georgia, which is just not the case. And if you'll read discussions of the Miccosukee and the Cheaha and such references as Wikipedia, they'll state that they were a South Georgia tribe. That is just not true. The Cheaha were from the Little Tennessee Valley in what is now far western North Carolina, Graham County, The Sokee were from northeast Georgia and to a lesser extent from an area immediately north of there in North Carolina. However, John Swanton had an enormous influence on the so-called body of knowledge of anthropology today. Swanton pretended to know the Creek languages, but virtually all of his translations are entirely wrong. Many of his interpretations of Creek culture history are also wrong, mainly because he didn't know what the words meant, and he ascribed different meanings than they actually were. Unfortunately, subsequent generations of academicians and archaeologists in the southeast United States never did any more ethnological research and accepted Swanton's erroneous speculations as scientific facts. This is the principal cause of major errors in our history books to this day. However, there's another source of information on the Miccosukee, which is extremely interesting, and it's first-hand information, not speculations. In 1911, Johnny Lazelle became a school teacher to the people now known as the Miccosukee. He was sent to staff a new Indian school in Indiantown, Florida, east of Lake Okeechobee. He was the first educated white man to ever live among the Seminoles. That is amazing, but this is our first time that we had a man with a college education who lived an extensive period of time with the Seminole people and really learned to know their culture and language. Lazelle was interviewed by the Palm Beach Post newspaper on March 1st, 1917. The word Miccosukee was unknown among the whites in Florida at that time and was not used by the newspaper. The newspaper called the Seminoles of southern Florida Mayas. That is very important information for the issues that we're now facing in the 21st century. And as you notice here, this famous statue of Etowah mounds on the side profile looks very much like a photograph of a full-blooded Miccosukee lady taken in around 1950. We're not sure the date, but you can see that she strongly reflects her Mesoamerican roots. In the subsequent published article in the Palm Beach Post, Lazelle made it very clear this particular band of the Seminoles was a separate ethnic group, culturally different than the majority members in either the Seminole Alliance or the Creek Confederacy. He stated that all Seminoles at that time in South Florida considered themselves to be Mayas, and they called themselves Mayas. They did not call themselves Seminoles or Creeks. Lazelle also made another surprising statement. A considerable percentage of the Seminoles in South Florida were descended from Yucatan Mayas who fled to Lake Okeechobee region after the Spanish invaded Yucatan in the 1520s. You'll never read that in a history book. Once in Florida, they adapted to the hunting, fishing, and gardening lifestyle of their Maya cousins who had always lived in the region, or at least for several centuries. And so they lost some of their more advanced cultural traits. He stated that the South Florida Seminoles, Miccosukee, or Mayas, is whatever you want to call them, described the Creeks and the Muskogee-speaking Seminoles as being descendants of earlier Maya bands from Mexico who immigrated to the southeast, then mixed with various less advanced tribes in the region, which altered their language. Lazelle then told the surprising origin of the Miccosukee people. They were descendants of a civilization in southern Mexico that was even older than the Mayas. In 1911, scholars did not even know about the Olmec civilization. In fact, it was just being discovered by the pioneer archaeologists of Mexico, but did not have a name at that time. They really weren't sure what they were finding, but they knew it was older than the Mayas. Well, here we are in 1911 in South Florida, someone knowing about the Olmec civilization. So Lazelle's information has to be true. There's no way that the remotely located Miccosukee in South Florida would have known about the Olmec civilization unless indeed they had been part of it. They continued to live in southern Mexico and were participants in the Maya culture, but they said they did not live in the large cities. Their towns greatly resembled the Native American towns in the southeast of that period. They had earthen mounds, did very little stone architecture. There was no stone available. You probably would have not known whether you were in a Creek town or a Sokee town during that period. They're so similar. And in fact, do you see this U-shaped or horseshoe-shaped ball court here? We're finding identical ball courts in northeast Georgia. Same size, they're running around 145 to 150 feet wide, 315 feet long, U-shaped. Many are still visible from satellite imagery. That shows another tie between the two regions. Sometime after the Maya civilization subsided, the Miccosukee's ancestors were conquered by a powerful nation in the north. This was probably the Mexica, which is normally called the Aztecs. A band of the Sokee fled northward along the Great White Path, which was a major road in eastern Mexico along the Gulf of Mexico, picking up bands from other peoples oppressed by the Mexica. They eventually reached the Chattahoochee River, then followed it to its source, where they created a new homeland. The timing places the Sokee arriving in northeast Georgia probably around 1250, 1300, 1350 AD. We're really not sure. There are no radiocarbon dates for the sites we're studying. That means they probably had nothing to do with the construction of the stone buildings and petroglyphs we're finding in the area, but that is not a definite fact. It could very well be that the Sokee originated in that area, went to Mexico, and then came back. It's a question that has not been answered. Here's you a map so you can visualize the migrations that we just discussed in this program. The initial migration, beginning here in Tabasco State and southern Veracruz, followed the edge of the Gulf of Mexico, the Great White Path, continued to the mouth of the Apalachicola River, then followed it northward into the Chattahoochee River all the way to the source of the Chattahoochee. The Sokee River is a major tributary of the Chattahoochee at its headwaters. Then, when the Creek-Cherokee War broke out in 1716, many of the Sokee moved southward. Some went down into the Okeechobee Swamp eventually. Others followed the Chattahoochee River. This is probably the largest percentage of the Sokee went this way, by the way. They followed the Chattahoochee River to roughly the vicinity of Columbus, where they were at the capital of the Creek Confederacy. They were assigned land immediately to the west in what is now Lee County, Alabama. That's the area where Auburn and Opelika is now. Their village was located north of Auburn in what is now Waverly, Alabama, but then was known as Thlopthlocco. After the First Creek War, many were forced to migrate westward into the New Creek Nation on the Arkansas River in Oklahoma. However, a sizable percentage of the Sokee around Waverly and Auburn and Opelika elected to take state citizenship. They were given allotments. They became citizens of the territory of Alabama and then the state of Alabama, and their descendants live there to that day. That is why when I met with the town council in Waverly, everybody there were part Creek Indian and very proud of it. They could trace their ancestry to that very same location at Waverly as far as their family memory went. Now, the other band that became the direct ancestors of Miccosukee went south to Okefenokee as the population of Georgia expanded. Probably in the late 1700s, they migrated into central Florida. When the Seminole Wars broke out after the War of 1812, they fought in the war. They were some of the more successful bands in fighting the United States Army, and they escaped capture by moving farther south into the edge of the Everglades southeast of Lake Okeechobee. This is where they were in the early 20th century. However, in around 1950, the U.S. government tried to dissolve the government of the Seminole people in Florida, which they bitterly opposed, and eventually they had the support of Florida politicians in their fight to maintain their identity. During the 1950s, eventually the people that would have become the Miccosukee obtained a reserve southwest of Lake Okeechobee, right here at Big Cypress. So they were forced to move again to this area, which is on the Tamiami Trail coming from Miami. And that's where they're located today. So there was multiple migrations. They did not want to be in the same tribe as the other descendants of the Creeks, and I explained to you why earlier. They trace their ancestry to southern Mexico, either from here, where they started out in Tabasco, or in the 1500s from northeastern Yucatan, where they migrated to Cuba and then to South Florida. They consider themselves Maya, and they want to maintain that identity. Now, what happened to the small band of Sokee that were in North Carolina? They were here, roughly in the vicinity of Lake Junaluska in Haywood County. They had good relations with their English-speaking neighbors, Anglo-Americans, and as a result of a series of political events, that band, which was led by Junaluska, was eventually allowed to settle on what had been the eastern edge of the Cherokee Nation in what is now Robbinsville, North Carolina, in Graham County. Now, they're no longer at Robbinsville because that's the 84th parallel. Eventually, they were assigned lands west of Robbinsville in the Snowbird Mountains and became known as the Snowbird Cherokees. They attracted quite a few Yuchi families from North Georgia and also some Cherokee families from the Qualla Reservation about 40 miles to the east. However, these people here, Snowbird, have a separate identity. They look different in general from the main body of Eastern Cherokees on the main reservation, and the Qualla Cherokees call them moon faces. That is because many of the families on the Snowbird Reservation look like the famous Olmec heads. There's no doubt that they are also descended from the Olmec civilization, along with the Thlopthlocco band in Oklahoma. Fascinating history that's been left out of the books. This ends this program. We have two more programs coming up on the Miccosukee. One will look at their religion, which was very different than the religion of most of the Creek Confederacy and kept to its Mesoamerican roots. We'll also look at some of the folklore of the Miccosukee that were told to John Lazelle while he was teaching them in the early 20th century. Thank you. We'll see you soon.